Welcome to the tutorial Creating Basic Effects. So in this tutorial, I'm going to use the material that I used in Pack 6, Gathering Content. If you download that sample material, you might realize that it does not come with the background, and that's because we didn't have the rights to give you the background because it was created by someone else. But you do have this character, and you can always import in your own background, which was the point of that PAX exercise. In this tutorial, I'm going to also toggle back and forth between Animate and Animate Pro to show you how to add the same effect in the two different softwares. The effects that we're going to show you are called basic effects because they're all the effects that exist in Animate. Animate Pro comes with a lot of other effects that we're not going to specifically show you how to use, but hopefully through seeing the various basic effects, because there are quite a few, you'll get an idea of how to set up the other effects on your own. So the effect we're going to start with is the blending effect. And to add the blending effect in Animate, you go to the timeline and once again click on this plus button with the little black arrow and select Effect, Blending. So right now there's nothing hooked up to it, so we need to hook a layer to this effect in order to see what it does. So what I'm going to select is this white karate rabbit text that I created quite a few tutorials ago, and I actually animated it so it gets bigger in this kind of cheesy 80s style way. So we're gonna hook that onto the blending effect by selecting it, then dragging it and dropping it on top of the blending effect. And once again, we know that it now belongs to the blending effect because it's been indented, and if you collapse the blending layer, you can see that it disappears. So we know it's now been parented, as we say, to the blending effect, and it's acting as the child. So the way the blending effect works is much like the way layer blending effects work in Photoshop. So if you've worked a lot with Photoshop, this will all seem very familiar. So if you double click on the blending effect, you'll bring up its layer properties window. And you'll notice that there are two different types of blend modes. There's the regular blend mode and the SWF blend mode. So to see any of these effects work, you have to be in the render view mode, which is this one right here. So let's go there to see a preview. And just as in Photoshop, you know, if you have something that's white and you multiply it, it completely disappears. If you show the difference, you kind of get this cheesy 80s style look again where it's overlapping with the shapes in the background. So you get the idea though, specifically through this effect, that what's being done to this layer, because it's on the top of the layer stack of the timeline, affects all the layers beneath, because not only is it affecting the mountain, it's affecting this branch, it's affecting the sky. So it's clearly touching upon all the various layers that exist in this Flash file that we imported, which is basically all these different elements: the pagoda, mountains, trees, sky. To preview these effects, because it's hard to scroll across and see them work, this one's not so bad, but you don't really see it smoothly because it's trying to render this effect. What you actually have to do is render a preview, and you do that by clicking on this button right here. It's telling me that some frames have already been rendered, and if I would like to render these frames again, and I would, just because I was practicing a bit. I already rendered this scene a few times. If it's your first time, you probably won't see this message, but if it's your second time rendering the same scene, you will, and you say yes because you want to see a render of any changes that you've made. So now if we press on the play button, you can actually see a render of the effect as well as the rest of your scene. The SWF blend mode works a bit differently. So let's double click on that. So let's bring our blend mode back to normal. And the difference is unfortunately with the SWF blend mode, no matter what changes you make, so if you select the exact same effect, you won't see it in either the render view or in the OpenGL view. You really have to render a preview to see the way that this effect works. So let's actually try overlay. It's actually quite a nice effect. And I'm gonna this time click on the second playback button, and you can see that it has like a red star filled in with white instead of this yellow star. So this yellow star is mimicking the yellow star you see next to a layer effect, so you know this render will render regular layer effects. This actually represents a flash render, so an SWF render, and the red is there to remind you that it's for a flash render. So this actually launches in a web browser. And if we play it again, you can actually see the results of this layer effect in the preview. So in my mind, the reason that you would use an SWF blend mode versus the regular blend mode is because you want to export for web. SWF effects, there are fewer of them, they're more light when they're rendered. So if you're going to put something on the web, it's great to have something like that because it's fast and it's not very heavy. However, if you're looking for something for a high quality render, most of the time you would use a regular blend mode. It takes longer to render, but once again, that's very, very normal. Okay, now let's take a look at Animate Pro. So in Animate Pro, we have the exact same scene. I created some white text that if you scroll across, gets bigger. But this time I think I'm going to use the orange text instead. It's not animated, but I'd like you to see what the blending modes look like when you use a layer that is not white. So the difference between adding an effect in Animate and Animate Pro is that in Animate Pro, of course, we add it through the network view. So let's look for our orange text in the network view, and I've selected the layer here in the timeline view, and we can see that it's become highlighted in the network view. So I'm going to zoom in on that. So we can see here that it says Karate Rabbit text orange. So we're going to use the exact same effect, the blending effect, and I'm going to drag it and drop it in the network view. It's under the filters tab, but you can also find it under the all tab in alphabetical order right here, for example, and maybe another tab, who knows. And I'm going to add it to the timeline view by holding down Alt as I drag it across the Karate Rabbit text orange cable. So then if we click on the yellow box, we'll bring up the layer properties, and they look identical to the layer properties that we just saw in Animate. I'm going to go to the render mode so we can see what the effect looks like as we change settings for the blend mode. This is the regular blend mode. So this time when I go to multiply, if you remember with the white, it disappeared completely because when you multiply white, it becomes transparent. But here you can see that it actually the orange becomes like a darker burnt orange on top of the other layers, the mountain, the sky, etc. You can try it a few others. The difference, the colors are way more vibrant. They don't take on those ultraviolet tones, but now we have reds and greens in here, etc. So obviously it depends on the colors of the layer that's attached to the effect, or the module that's attached to the effect, that will change what the blend mode looks like on top of the other drawing elements in the layer stack. So everything else is exactly the same. If you want to do a render, you could use this render button here. If you selected an effect from the SWF blend mode, once again, you can render it using this button. So other than that, it's identical to what we just saw in Animate. Okay, now let's go back to Animate. So I'm going to open up another scene that'll be more appropriate to show you the next effects. And I'm going to select the Animate Pro Pack 14 again, the sample material that is. Okay, so this error message is appearing because the Karate Rabbit cutout puppet was created in Animate Pro and not Animate. So just click on the OK button and don't worry too much about the effects that are not supported. So this scene is the sample material scene for pack number 14. And if we click on the play button, we can see it's a scene with the camera truck in where the punching bag spins back and forth. The door slides open and we see the karate rabbit doing some exercises out here on the balcony railing. So the effect that I'd like to show you in this scene is how to add a shadow. And the object that I'd like to add the shadow to is actually the punching bag. So when you add a shadow, you not only add the shadow effect, but you also usually add a quad map. And what a quad map does, or what you can do with a quad map, is take a copy of your principal drawing object and flip it so that it's like a mirror reflection, and then also squash, stretch, scale, and skew it so that it's sort of angled and flattened in a way that a shadow normally would be for any drawing object. So the first thing you need to do in Animate when creating a shadow effect is to turn the object that you'd like to add the effect to into a symbol. So in this case, it's going to be the punching bag, and not only the punching bag, but also its peg. And the reason for this is because when you create the shadow, inevitably you're going to want to animate the shadow to follow your drawing object. So the punching bag is already animated to swing back and forth, so it's very convenient to create a copy of these keyframe movements so that when you add an effect to its copy is already animated in exactly the same way. So to create a symbol, I'm just going to collapse the peg here. Select the desired layer, then go to the top menu and select Edit, Create Symbol, or you can use the keyboard shortcut F8. Then the software is going to ask you to name your symbol. So I'm just going to name it punching bag dash peg and say OK. Then if you go to the library and to the symbols folder, so not the Animate library, but the symbols folder, you'll see that your symbol is housed there. So what you can do is then take your symbol and you can either drag and drop it into the camera view or into the left side of the timeline. So if I disable my punching bag from view, you can see that the one on top here is a symbol, and you can tell that it's a symbol because its frames sort of look like a purple film strip. So then what I'm going to do is duplicate the layer by right-clicking and selecting Duplicate Selected Layer. And then from the Add Layer menu, so it's this plus button here with a little black arrow, I'm going to select Quad Map. So the quad map's automatically added to the bottom of the layer stack. So I'm going to take the second symbol, so the copy of the symbol that I created, and drag it down to the bottom of my timeline and drag it over the quad map and then drop it there. And you can see that the punching bag dash P underscore 2 symbol has now been hooked onto the quad map. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit here in the camera view, and you can do that by using Command minus or Control minus if you're using Windows. And then I'm going to reselect the quad map layer in the timeline view, and then go to the top menu and select View, Show, Control. So now a bounding box appears, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's a number 1 in the left topmost corner, a number 2, a number 3, and a number 4. And what this corresponds to, if you double click on the quad map layer, are the numbers in its layer properties. So here we have 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and 0.4. So unless you're very good with cardinal coordinates, north, south, east, west, as well as a 12-field animation grid system, it's often easier to use the transform tool in the camera view to manipulate your shadow rather than use these coordinates. But I can show you quickly how to use the coordinates. If you change 0.1, which is the one right here, to 12 south, it's actually going to flip and be put where the number 3 is. But we want it to go past. It doesn't have to be completely mirrored. That would take us to 36 fields, so 1.5 times 12 south, and south is what makes it negative. Let's just try 24 south. So if I change this to 24 south, we'll see that that point just got flipped in the camera view. And we do the same thing for the second point here. So this would also become 24 south. So same thing. So now we have a mirror image, well, a somewhat flattened mirror image of our punching bag. However, I feel that most people would find it more intuitive just to grab, the white bounding box points and skew and scale and move this using this transformation box. So I probably want it touching maybe the bottom of my punching bag. I might flatten it a bit. So something like that, for example. Maybe I'll straighten this out. And you can see as I was moving these coordinates around that these fields, these function fields for each point in the layer properties now have some type of a function marked in each field. So I'm going to close that. And right now, if we go to the render view mode, which is how we're able to see all our effects, we'll see that a second version of the punching bag appears. But on top of this, what we'd like to do is we'd also like to make it gray and transparent and slightly blurry, in fact. So to do this, we have to actually add the shadow effect. So what I'm going to do is go back to my Add Layer button, and this time I'm going to go to the Effects menu and select Shadow. This time the shadow is added to the top here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse my quad map and then drag it to the top and drop it over the shadow effect. So now my quad map is hooked to my shadow, or parented to my shadow, and my punching bag peg is parented to my quad map. So right now it looks like it's the same color as it was before, but if we go into the render view mode, you'll see that it now becomes gray, transparent, and slightly blurry, exactly what we'd like to see. Okay, and right now we see the shadow on top, obviously, because in the timeline view, this entire shadow effect is on top of the principal punching bag symbol. So what I'm going to do is grab the shadow and then just drag and drop it underneath, and now you can see that it's flipped behind. And you can see as we scroll around here that the shadow is in fact following the punching bag. So the shadow effect itself, if you double click on it, the parameters, the default parameters in the layer properties are set to pretty much what you would like them to be. You know, there's a blur of radius 2 for the shadow. It's already gray, it already has transparency, but once again, you can double click on the effect layer and change its layer properties to tailor the shadow as you would like. So now I'm going to show you how to create the exact same effect in Animate Pro. So let's go back to Animate Pro, and I'm going to open the exact same scene. So if I click on the play button here, we can see that it's identical to the scene that I just showed you for Pack 14 for Animate. So this time, if we want to add a shadow effect and a quad map effect to the punching bag, we're going to do it all in the network view. So first, let's bring all our elements together. Okay, so to add a few effects modules in the network view, we can go once again to our module library, and I'm going to go to the Alt tab because I know I'll be able to find everything there. So along with the shadow and quad map effect, there's actually one more module that we need, and that's the Apply Peg Transformation module. So I'm going to drop that in there as well. And then I'm just going to click on this little arrow here to expand the network view, because that's all we really need to look at right now. The first thing I'm going to do is just move the punching bag and its peg a little bit further to make some room. And then I'm going to connect the Apply Peg Transformation module between the punching bag and the composite. And I'm going to do that once again by holding down the Alt key. And it automatically goes to the blue port, so the correct port. The next thing I'm going to do is add the quad map, and I'm going to add it to this side. I don't think it matters which port. And the last thing I'm going to do is take the shadow and hold down the Alt key once again and put it in between the apply peg transformation, the composite. So the only thing I'm missing now is that this is what's creating my shadow effect, and I'll explain it to you all in just a second. But you may notice that because all of this is going on, we're only going to see a version of the punching bag as a transformed shadow. So we would like a version of the punching bag that's just rotating. So this peg is rotating the punching bag, and this is the full color original drawing. So if we just want these two things to appear in the drawing view, what we can do is grab a second cord from the punching bag and hook it to the composite in front of its shadow. So the shadow will be underneath. So this is just taking the position information, the drawing information, and putting it to the front of the composite so it's seen on top of all other layers in the camera view. Now if we take a look at what I've put together here, you can see that we definitely want our shadow to still rotate back and forth. We want it to follow the full original colored version. So we're going to take both the punching bag and its peg and hook it to the apply peg transformation. Then once it's hooked here, if there's any position information coming in, such as with the quad map, it'll be affected to this version of the punching bag and its peg. So then after it gets transformed by the quad map, it will then go through the shadow filter or the shadow effect, which is what makes it transparent and gray and somewhat blurry. And all of this, once again, is hooked into the composite behind the original punching bag. So if we didn't have the apply peg transform, for example, I'm just going to delete that. You might say, well, why didn't I just directly put the quad map here between the punching bag peg and the punching bag? Well, if I did that, then the full colored version as well as the shadowed version would be transformed. So the apply peg transformation is a way around adding two position information modules connected to a single drawing element. So I'm just going to undo that to bring back my apply peg transform. So then if I minimize our window again, and I'm just going to minimize the module library for the instant, and I select the quad map, you can see, and actually let me just zoom out a bit in the camera view, you can see the same bounding box that we saw in Animate with the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And of course, if you click on the yellow square, you'll bring up the layer properties. And once again, you could enter in values into the layer properties panel, or you can use the transform tool and do it in the camera view. So just to re-explain the 12 field system one more time, here we'd have 12 fields, here we'd have 0, so this would be 12 fields north. Here we'd have 12 fields south where the number 3 is. So if you think about it, if you want to make an exact mirror copy, you would go 12 fields south, another 12 fields south, which would take us to a reflection from the 0 point. And then once again, another 12 fields south. So that would be 1, 2, 3. So 3 times 12 fields south is 36 fields south. So that's what would give us a direct reflection. If we wanted a more squashed reflection, we could go to about 24, which would be almost like adding another increment about as long as from the 3 to the midpoint. So it's up to you. I'll do it one more time. I'll go all the way to 36 south to show you a direct reflection. And if we back up a bit here in the camera view, you can see that it's a mirror reflection. But now I'm just going to grab the corners or the white boxes of the bounding box and do it in the camera view, because for me that's more intuitive. And once again, you can skew the shadow as well to something like that, for example. So I'm going to close the layer properties, and I'm going to reset the view by holding down Shift and M. And now if we click on the play button, you can see that the shadow is following once again. It's the color it should be, which is gray and transparent. So we've completed a successful effect. So the next effect I'd like to show you is how to add highlight and tone, and we're going to do that once again in a different scene. So let's save this scene. And actually, we're going to go back to Animate. And then let's open up another Animate scene. So yes, we'd like to save. So I'm going to open up pack 20, but it looks like it's only for Animate Pro, so I'm going to resave it just for Animate. Okay, so it's telling me all these things are not working because this is once again for Animate Pro, not Animate, so I'm just going to say OK. And I'm going to save this scene. As Animate Pack 20 instead of Animate Pro. So I don't know if you recall, but in Pack 20 we learned how to perform a lip sync for our character, and I'll show you what the final result looked like.
The act of taking the first bite is what separates the winners from the losers.
So in this scene I'd like to show you how to add a tone and a highlight, and that has nothing to do with lip syncing. I just wanted a scene where we had a big version of the character's face so we could really see the tone and highlight as we block it in. So to create a highlight effect in Animate, we're going to once again go to our Add Layer button, scroll down and select Effect, Highlight. And we've effectively added a highlight effect. So you'll notice that the highlight effect has two parts, the highlight layer itself and a mask. So the layer that we want to attach to the highlight itself is easy. It's going to be the Karate Rabbit. However, the mask is going to be a new drawing layer that we're going to create, and that's going to be a section where we're going to add a drawing that has the area that we would like to apply the highlight to on the Karate Rabbit. Anywhere where there's an overlap, that's where that highlight is going to be performed, using the mask as a guide to let the effect know where to apply the highlight. So let's create a new drawing layer, and I'm going to name it Highlight Matte. So that's easy enough. Then let's go to the drawing view, and I'm going to turn on the light table so that we can see the Karate Rabbit's face. So I'm going to scroll down and zoom in a bit. Like that. Then I'm going to go to the color palette. And we're in the Rabbit's color palette right now. I'm going to scroll down. In one of the other tutorials, we used two indicator colors. So I'm going to select the green one right now. I believe it's semi-transparent. Yeah, the alpha has been lowered, so you can sort of see through it. And then I'm going to take the brush, and let's just see. How thick this brush is. It's not as thick as I'd like. Let's make it a little bit thicker. And what we're going to do is apply the zones for where we'd like the highlight to appear. So let's say right here on the ear, right here on the ear, on this side of the Karate Rabbit's face, here on the neck. And you can obviously refine this matte so that it really does cover the areas properly. For example, the neck, right now the mask touches the G a little bit, so his robe. So if you could take an eraser and then really refine it so it really only touches the part of the Karate Rabbit where you would like to see a highlight. So like that. And by keeping it transparent, you can see where the overlap will occur. If the color were solid, for example, you can't really see where the overlap occurs. So for me, personally, I like to use a semi-transparent color. So then if we go back to the camera view, and we take the highlighted matte layer and we hook it to the mask, and once again we do this by dragging it and dropping it over the mask until we see it indented. And then what we're going to do is take the Karate Master group and we're going to drag and drop that over the highlight, like so. And then if we go to the render view, I don't know if you can see it, it's pretty subtle right now, but there's a highlight over the area where I added the matte. And let's double click on the highlight layer and maybe make its properties a bit more intense so that we can see it. So maybe if I choose the invert matte, for example, you can see a big difference. Now this is all highlighted and this small band has remained dark. So that's one thing you can use. You can use the matte color, which makes it very intense. You can multiply it, which also makes it more intense. For example, you can change the blur radius. You can do all sorts of things. You can change the alpha, which would also make it more intense if you made it less transparent. So once again, you can tailor the highlight's properties in the layer properties panel. So now if you wanted to add a tone to the exact same drawing element, so that's the karate rabbit, you could do it exactly in the same way. So let's go back to our Add Layer button and select Effect, Tone. So once again, we see that the tone also has its own mask. So let's create another mask layer by going to the Add Drawing Layer button. And let's rename this Tone Matte. And then let's go to the drawing view once more, enable our light table, zoom into the rabbit's face, I'm going to use the same indicator color, and my brush has already been selected, and this time I'm going to put the shadow over here on this side. And like I said, I'm doing this very crudely, so you can do this in a more refined manner to make it look nicer. So something like that. Then let's hook the tone matte to the mask of the tone effect by dragging and dropping it. And then let's collapse the highlight group, which is the highlight mask, the highlight matte, and the karate rabbit, and drag the entire thing over the tone layer to hook this entire group onto the tone effect. And now if we go back to the camera view and click on the render view button, I don't know once again if you can see it because it's very subtle, but there's a dark band here, a dark band on the side of the karate rabbit's face and by its neck. And if we once again click on the tone layer, we can bring up its layer properties. And you can do all the same things. You can invert your matte. So now everything's dark except for this one band, and of course where the highlight is already being seen. If you use the matte color, because it's green, it doesn't really work well as a tone color. You really should probably use like a dark gray or a dark brown, something like that. You can multiply it, which makes it a little bit more intense, etc. But you get the picture of how this effect works. So the two things that we have left to do is, first of all, I don't know if you noticed, but both the matte layers only exist for one frame. So we need to extend the exposure of these two matte layers so that they last beyond the first frame, because then if we flip to the next frame, they're gone. So at frame 50, the head of the karate rabbit changes. So the matte will no longer really apply to the same areas, or it cannot be applied to the same areas because the highlight will inevitably need to change, as will the tone. So let's just extend these two exposures up until frame 49. So I'm going to right click on frame 49 of the tone matte row and select extend exposure, or you could use the keyboard shortcut F5. And I'm going to do the same thing for the highlight matte. Okay, now we get to the problem of how to make the matte applicable for this head change. And it's actually quite easy. As soon as you start drawing here on the tone matte layer, you're creating another drawing, which is what you basically need. So let's go back to the drawing layer. We still have our indicator color selected, and this is for the tone, so it's going to be on this side. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to add some tone in here in the inside of the ear. I'll add it to the side of this head. And down by his neck. So now we have two different drawings on the same tone matte layer, which is needed for the mask for the tone effect. And I'm going to extend this exposure right till the end by doing the same thing, right clicking and selecting extend exposure. And we're going to do the same thing for the highlight layer. So our highlight will be over here. Once again, you can decide if this is not the proper place for a highlight. I'm just doing it quickly, like that. And we see the same thing, so it moves with the head change. And then I'm going to right click and select extend exposure. So now if we go back to the camera view and we click on the render button, you can see that for both these angles, the tone and the highlight remain. Okay, so now let's go to Animate Pro so I can show you how it's done in that software. So once again, we're going to open a new scene or a scene from another video tutorial. Okay, so as you can see, it's the exact same scene. If we click on the sound button and then press play, you can hear the lip sync once more.
The act of taking the first bite is what separates the winners from the losers.
So let's maximize our network view. And of course, we're going to do this one more time through the network view. So I'm going to unhide the module library. And for this effect, we will most definitely need the highlight as well as the tone. And as you can see, both the highlight and the tone have two blue ports. So this gives us an indication that it can take in two drawing layers. So one being the layer that it will act upon, so that would be the Karate Master layer, and another port for a matte, and that would be the leftmost port. So let's once again start with the highlight. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and pass between the Karate Master and the composite to hook the highlight to this cable. But it's not going to do anything yet because we don't have a matte. So let's add another drawing layer by going to the timeline and clicking on the Add Drawing Layer button. So now you can see that a new drawing layer has appeared. I'm going to keep it here so we can see, but I'm going to move it in front of the Karate Master, and we're going to go back to the camera view. In fact, we're going to the drawing view. We'll use a light table, so it's done exactly the same way. We're going to go back to frame 1, make sure we're on the correct drawing layer, use our indicator color, zoom in a bit, and start drawing our highlight. So this brush is quite big, so I might take it down a bit. Add the neck highlight. And there we go. And this time, because we know better, let's extend this exposure to the 49th frame. So at least it goes that far. And let's rename this drawing as Highlight Matte, as we did in the other software. Okay, now let's go back to the network view. And this time let's unhook our highlight mat and let's bring it up here and hook it into its proper port on the left side of the highlight effect module. Then let's go back to the camera view and go into render mode. And you can see it there nice and soft. You can even see it in the OpenGL view, but it doesn't have all that nice soft anti-aliasing. And once again, you have the choice of either double clicking on the highlight matte layer, on the highlight, effect layer, or by clicking on this little yellow box here beside the highlight module to bring up the layer properties. And you can do all the same things you did in the other software. You can invert the matte, you can use the matte color, you can multiply, you can do all of those things. And since we're here, let's make the second matte for the head change. So we're doing this in a little bit of a different order, but it's exactly the same thing. So we have our indicator color, our brush is selected, we're doing the highlight, so it looks something like this. And we're going to extend our exposure like that. We go back to the camera view and now we see that where the Karate Rabbit changes its head, the highlight follows. And so let's do the same thing for the tone now. So we're going back to the network view. We have our tone. So what I'm going to do now is unhook the highlight, which effectively also unhooks the entire Karate Rabbit drawing element, and place that into the right side of the tone and then hook the tone into the composite. So basically what's happening now is the tone is going to act on this entire group, so the highlight and the Karate Master. So the only thing we're missing now is a matte. So let's go back to the timeline, add another drawing layer, rename it Tone Matte, go back to frame number 1, go to the drawing view. We still have our brush selected, so that's good. We're going to put in where we'd like to see some tone. We're going to extend that exposure. Once again, the reason that I'm extending the exposure using the right click of my mouse is because the keyboard shortcut F5 happens to be a keyboard shortcut for my recording software as well, so that's why I'm doing it the long way instead of using F5 all the time. So let's go one frame over, paint our second matte for the 3/4 profile view of the Karate Rabbit, extend that exposure. And now let's unhook the matte from our composite and then hook it into the left side of the tone. And now if we go to the camera view, you can see that there's a tone on the left side of the Karate Rabbit and a highlight on the right side. You can double click on the tone. Oh, sorry, once again I keep selecting the matte on the tone effect, or you can click on this little yellow box to get the layer properties. You can do all the same things you did before, invert the matte, use the matte color, multiply, increase the blur radius. You can do all sorts of exciting things here in the layer properties panel. So you might be asking yourself, why did I choose this configuration in the network view? So let's go to the entire network view and let me try to untangle this just a little bit. So that you can see it properly. I'll put that over there. Okay, so you might ask yourself, why didn't I just take the Karate Master, because you can pull out a second cable, and put it directly in the drawing port of the tone, instead of having the entire highlight group go through the tone first. So what I'm saying is, why didn't I just do this? Like that. If we go back to the camera view, you'll see why. all of a sudden the tone isn't there anymore. And the reason this is because there's actually 2 copies of the Karate Rabbit now going into the composite, and they're solid copies. They're not transparent copies. So because the highlight happens to be in front, we see it here, the highlight layer is now seen in the camera view because the solid Karate Rabbit with its highlight is in the camera view. If we swap the ordering, I don't know if you can see it. Let me make the tone, so you can see it, the tone now is there, but the highlight isn't. And the reason that is because now the tone is in front. So a solid Karate Rabbit image with the tone now sits in front. So because you want both effects to act on the same solid object and not have one solid object in front of the other, you have to have the entire highlight group go through the tone. So we're going to unhook that, unhook the highlight, and put the highlight back into the tone group. And now you get both. Let's take that tone down again, maybe to something like that. And now you get both the tone and the highlight. So that's the one hard thing about effects, is that it feels like there are multiple ways of doing things, but there's generally usually only one right way of doing something. And if something isn't working or effect isn't appearing the way you want, you really have to think about your network structure. And that's what's hard. There's no system you can follow. It's a bit creative, and you have to really understand the network view to be able to go out and do things on your own. But don't worry, because that comes with a lot of practice. And like I said, if you make that mistake, you really just go through your network and think about it. Like, what is happening if I have the Karate Master plugged in twice? And just experiment and unplug and replug, because it's not going to hurt your image in any way. So there are a lot more effects that I still need to show you, but I feel like this video has gone on for quite some time, so I'm going to break it up into 2 videos. So I'm going to end this video and call it Creating Basic Effects Part 1, and I'm going to tell you to stay tuned for Creating Basic Effects Part 2.